You're standing under a canopy so thick that noon looks like dusk. It's roughly 150,000 years ago in what is now Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa, and sunlight barely touches the forest floor around you. Insects drone in the heat. Somewhere above you, monkeys are moving through branches you can't even see. There's a stone tool in your hand, and you are, as far as anyone can currently tell, one of the very first Homo sapiens on record to call a tropical rainforest home. Not visiting, not passing through on the way to somewhere better. Home. For most of the last century, scientists insisted this scene couldn't have happened, that rainforests were the one place early humans avoided. You're about to find out exactly how wrong that turned out to be. So, did ancient humans actually live in the rainforest? Seriously, think about it. Picture a rainforest. Dripping heat, dense understory, biting insects, big predators somewhere in the shadows, and soil so thin that large grazing animals, the kind you could actually spear and eat in bulk, mostly stay away. You'd think early humans who needed steady calories and open sightlines to survive would take one look at a jungle and turn back toward the nearest grassland. That's exactly what most 20th century archaeology assumed. The dominant idea, often called the savanna hypothesis, held that human evolution happened out on open plains, chasing herds under wide skies, and that dense wet forest was basically a wall, a green, tangled dead end you'd only enter if you got lost. Some researchers even had a nickname for it, the Green Desert. Beautiful to look at, nearly impossible to actually live in, or so the theory went. Except now the evidence says something close to the opposite, and it comes from 4 continents, several caves, and one discovery in 2025 that changed the whole timeline. Here's the thing nobody tells you about that old story. It wasn't wrong for one reason. It was wrong for several separate reasons on separate continents at separate points in time. It's not one thing. It's never one thing. There's a Kenyan cave occupied for 78,000 years straight. There's a skull in the depths of a Bornean rainforest. There are monkey hunters in Sri Lanka armed with tools smaller than a thumbnail. And there's a 2025 find in West Africa that pushed the whole story back by tens of thousands of years. Several layers here. Let's go. Here's what nobody tells you about the humans came from the savannah story. It was never fully proven. It just sounded right. For most of the 20th century, the working theory went like this. Our ancestors stood upright on the open plains of East Africa, freed their hands, started throwing spears at antelope, and slowly became us. Dense wet forest simply didn't fit that picture, so it got written out of it. Eleanor Seri, an archaeologist at Germany's Max Planck Institute, has said plainly that for a long time, research made a strong case that humans originated on East African savannas and colonized the rest of the world from there. And that model, in her words, doesn't really hold true anymore. Think about that for a second. An idea that shaped textbooks, documentaries, and 100 museum dioramas of spear throwers on golden grass was mostly an assumption wearing the costume of a conclusion. Part of the problem was practical, not theoretical. Rainforests eat evidence for breakfast, acidic soil dissolves bone. Constant humidity rots wood and plant fiber within years, not centuries. A campsite on a savanna can leave a stone tool sitting on the surface, readable, for 80,000 years. A campsite in a rainforest gets swallowed by roots, by mold, by the next flood, often within a single human lifetime. So archaeologists weren't only biased toward savanna stories out of habit, they were also quite literally digging where the evidence happened to survive. It's a bit like the old joke about the man searching for his lost keys under a street lamp. Not because he dropped them there, but because that's where the light is good. Archaeology had, for decades, been searching for the origins of humanity under the driest, best-lit patch of ground available. Part of the story's staying power also came from where the most famous early fossils happened to turn up. Finds like the roughly 3.2 million-year-old skeleton nicknamed Lucy, discovered in Ethiopia's arid Afar region, kept surfacing in dry, open terrain, which only reinforced the picture of ancestors striding across grassland. But Lucy belongs to Australopithecus afarensis, not Homo sapiens. A different branch of the family tree, millions of years earlier, built for a different world. Applying her landscape to every human who came after her is a bit like assuming your great-great-grandparents' old street tells you exactly where you're going to end up living. But better dating technology and a lot of patient work in the handful of caves that do preserve material started turning up something the old model never predicted. People, deep in the trees, far earlier than anyone had guessed. Here's what nobody tells you about Panga ya Saidi in Kenya. It's the opposite of a quick pit stop. This cave sits near Kenya's coast, in a landscape where open grassland grades into thick coastal tropical forest, the kind of in-between zone ecologists call an ecotone. In 2018, a team led by Michael Petraglia and Nicole Boyven, publishing in the journal Nature Communications, showed that people lived in and around this cave, on and off, for 78,000 years. Not a single visit. Not a rest stop on a longer journey. 78,000 years of generation after generation occupation, spanning ice ages and warm spells alike, right at the edge of the forest canopy. The site produced the oldest bead ever found in Kenya, a shell ornament dated to somewhere between 67 and 63,000 years old, alongside carved bone tools and lumps of red ochre pigment that people were clearly choosing to carry around and use. Around 67,000 years ago, the stone toolkit itself changes shape. Bulkier, middle. Stone Age tools give way to smaller, sharper implements, the kind of shift researchers associate with new, more precise hunting strategies. Think of it like upgrading from a butter knife to a scalpel, because dinner started running faster and hiding better. Living exactly on that boundary meant something practical, too. On a bad week out on the grassland, you could duck into the forest for tubers, fruit, and small game. On a bad week in the forest, you could step back out and track larger herds instead. It was less a compromise than a strategy, hedging against two different kinds of hunger at once. And here's the detail that surprised even the archaeologists who dug it up. Despite the coast sitting just 9 miles away, there's remarkably little seafood in the site's food remains. These weren't beachcombers who occasionally wandered inland when it suited them. They were forest and grassland specialists, building a genuinely sustainable way of life at the tree line, for a stretch of time longer than all of recorded human history, repeated more than 15 times over. To put 78,000 years in perspective, the pyramids at Giza have stood for roughly 4,500 years. This one cave was already a working address more than 17 times longer than that. Here's what nobody tells you about Borneo. It holds one of the oldest, densest rainforests on Earth, and people were living inside it, not at its edge, inside it. Tens of thousands of years ago. Deep in the Great Cave at Naya, in Sarawak, on the island of Borneo, archaeologists uncovered a human skull nicknamed the Deep Skull back in the 1950s. Decades later, careful redating using uranium series methods on the bone itself, combined with radiocarbon dating of nearby charcoal, placed it at somewhere between 45 and 39,000 years old, most likely around 37,000. That makes it the earliest securely dated anatomically modern human found anywhere in island Southeast Asia. And this wasn't savanna, or coastline, or a forest grassland mix like Panga ya Saidi. This was closed canopy tropical rainforest. Hot, wet, and biologically overwhelming, with trees taller than a 10-story building and more insect species crammed into a single acre than most countries have species of mammal. Living there wasn't a fallback plan for people who couldn't find anywhere better. Getting from the coast to that cave meant pushing through some of the thickest, most disorienting vegetation on the planet with no open sightlines and no herds of grazing animals to follow along the way. Somebody made that journey anyway, and stayed long enough to be buried there, generations deep. It's a little like discovering someone set up permanent camp inside a maze, and not only survived, but thrived. Modern hikers get turned around in far tamer jungle with a compass, a trail map, and a phone signal. Whoever reached that cave had none of that, and evidently didn't need it. Here's what nobody tells you about hunting in a rainforest. The easy prey simply doesn't exist there. There's no herd of bison to run down across open ground. What you've got instead is small, fast, and usually sitting 40 feet above your head in a tree canopy, watching you fumble around down on the forest floor. At Fahayan Lena Cave in Sri Lanka, researchers led by Oshan Wedege of the Max Planck Institute, working with Patrick Roberts and Michael Petraglia, found exactly how ancient humans solved that problem. The cave itself sits in Sri Lanka's wet zone, a belt of forest that gets several meters of rain a year, thick with fig trees and wild fruit, laced with the dense, layered canopy that langurs and squirrels use as their own private highway system. Published around 2019, their study dated the site's stone microliths, tiny, precisely shaped tools smaller than a thumbnail, to between 48 and 45,000 years old, making them the earliest evidence of human occupation in Sri Lanka and the oldest known microlith technology found anywhere in a rainforest setting. These weren't crude stone flakes. They were small and sharp enough to be mounted as points on arrows or darts, the rainforest equivalent of trading in a sledgehammer for a scalpel. And the animal bones scattered across the cave floor told researchers exactly what those tiny weapons were for. The most common prey wasn't deer or wild pig. It was the southern Hanuman langur, a tree-dwelling monkey, along with several species of squirrel, fast, alert, semi-arboreal animals that spend their entire lives leaping through branches. As Weddich put it, the evidence demonstrates specialized, sophisticated hunting of arboreal monkey and squirrel populations going back 45,000 years. Here's the detail that really shows how deliberate this was. The hunters mostly targeted adult monkeys rather than juveniles, generation after generation, meaning they weren't wiping out the local population. They were managing it, the way a careful angler releases the small fish to keep the pond stocked. That's sustainable, calculated hunting in one of the hardest environments on the planet to hunt in at all. Michael Petraglia called it proof of the behavioral and technological flexibility of our species. Proof that when the easy calories disappeared, Homo sapiens didn't retreat. They upgraded their toolkit and stayed. Here's what nobody tells you about surviving in a rainforest long term. Catching the occasional monkey isn't the hard part. Staying alive there for generations is. Tropical forests are calorie for calorie, some of the toughest environments on Earth for a human body to make a living in. Large, meaty animals are rare because the dense canopy blocks the sunlight that would otherwise grow the grass that feeds big grazing herds, which is exactly why open savanna looks, on paper, like the easier choice. Diseases thrive in the constant heat and standing water, and many of the most abundant plant foods are loaded with natural toxins. Bitter forest tubers related to modern cassava carry compounds that release cyanide unless you know precisely how to grate, soak, and cook them first, a skill that takes real, hard-won cultural knowledge to develop and pass down. Get it wrong, and dinner poisons you instead of feeding you. Processing those toxic tubers isn't a 5-minute task either. Traditional detoxification, still practiced by rainforest communities today, involves peeling, grating, soaking the pulp in water for a day or more, then drying or cooking it. A multi-step routine that has to be taught, practiced, and gotten exactly right every single time. Skip a step, rush the soak, and the same plant that has safely fed a village for generations turns dangerous again. There's a genetic echo of this struggle too. Several human populations with long histories in tropical regions carry gene variants, including the sickle cell trait, that offer partial protection against malaria, a trade-off that shows up almost nowhere in populations without a deep rainforest or tropical history. That's not folklore. That's natural selection, running for thousands of years, in direct response to the exact environment the old theory insisted humans avoided. Researchers have actually measured the dietary side of this adaptation directly too. In a 2015 study published in the journal Science, Patrick Roberts and Michael Petraglia analyzed the tooth enamel of 26 ancient individuals from Sri Lankan sites, including the rock shelter of Batadombalena, using mass spectrometry to trace the chemical fingerprints left behind by decades of eating specific foods. The isotope signatures showed people living almost entirely on rainforest resources, not supplementing with savanna game, going back at least 20,000 years, with hints of similar rainforest-focused diets reaching even further back. So how did people actually pull this off, again and again across 3 separate continents? Researchers Patrick Roberts and Brian Stewart, in a 2018 study published in Nature Human Behavior, argue that Homo sapiens developed something genuinely unusual for a hominin, what they call a generalist-specialist niche. Instead of adapting to just one habitat, our species adapted to habitat switching itself, moving between deserts, high-altitude mountains, coastlines, and dense forests, and becoming locally expert in each one. Neanderthals, by comparison, stayed largely tied to more open, temperate landscapes. It wasn't raw strength or a bigger brain alone that let Homo sapiens outlast every other human species. It was the willingness and the accumulated know-how to master environments that should have been unlivable, including, it turns out, the one everyone assumed was permanently off limits. Here's what nobody tells you about Africa's own rainforests. For a long time, almost nobody was looking there at all. The Congo Basin holds the second largest tropical rainforest on Earth after the Amazon, spanning parts of 6 countries, and for most of the 20th century, it remained one of the least archaeologically surveyed regions on the planet. Not because nothing happened there, but because dense canopy, difficult logistics, and decades of regional instability made fieldwork extraordinarily hard to carry out. Compare that to East Africa's Rift Valley, crisscrossed by roads, universities, and nearly a century of continuous excavation, and it's easy to see why the fossil record looked so lopsided for so long. Of course, early human evolution seemed to center on open grassland. That's largely where researchers had the access, the funding, and the safety to dig. It's a little like judging the size of an entire ocean by the one well-lit swimming pool you've actually been allowed to visit. Every year, as more Central and West African sites get surveyed with modern tools, the map of where ancient humans actually lived keeps filling in. And it keeps filling in with forest, not open plain, which sets up the discovery that, more than any other, finally forced the whole field to rewrite its assumptions. Now let's be honest, because it's tempting to swing too far the other way, and imagine every ancient human sprinting straight for the nearest jungle. That's not what happened either. Most Pleistocene humans, for most of that period, still lived in open or mixed landscapes. Savanna, scrub, coastal plains, river valleys. Rainforest occupation wasn't the default. It was one option among several, used by specific groups at specific times, alongside plenty of humans living the more familiar, textbook, open country life. Some rainforest sites were occupied seasonally rather than year-round. Fahien Lena and Naya both show gaps in returns over thousands of years, not one unbroken settlement from day one. And caution is still warranted. Rainforest environments shift over tens of thousands of years. So, forest at one date doesn't always mean the exact dense closed canopy jungle of a modern nature documentary. Some of these zones were mosaics, mixing forest patches with more open ground nearby. So this isn't a story where humans secretly preferred the jungle all along, and the savanna theory was pure fiction. It's a story where the jungle turned out to be a livable option nobody had seriously tested. And once tested, it worked again and again for tens of thousands of years at a stretch. There's one last piece saved for the end, because it's the part that actually rewrites the timeline, not just the map. In February 2025, a team led by Eslam Ben Araous published a paper in the journal Nature describing a site called Bedefers, about 20 kilometers north of Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, modern-day West Africa. Using updated dating techniques on layered sediment, they showed that stone tools at the site, including large picks, date back at least 150,000 years. Pollen trapped in those same layers came overwhelmingly from African elemi and oil palm trees, plants that together made up as much as 80% of the samples, a chemical and botanical signature that only makes sense if a genuine wet tropical forest surrounded that site at the time. Before this discovery, the oldest confirmed evidence of rainforest habitation anywhere in Africa sat at around 18,000 years. The oldest confirmed rainforest evidence on the entire planet, from sites in Southeast Asia, sat at around 70,000 years. This one found at Bété. I didn't just nudge those numbers. It obliterated them, pushing the record back by more than double into a period roughly contemporary with the earliest fossil evidence for Homo sapiens as a species at all. Think about what that actually means. It means our species may not have wandered into the rainforest as a desperate late-stage detour once the easy savanna land filled up. It may have been living in dense tropical forest from very close to the beginning. The rainforest wasn't the wall at the edge of the human story. There's a real chance it was part of the nursery. And that's not a metaphor. That's 150,000 years of pollen, stone, and sediment sitting quietly under a Côte d'Ivoire hillside, waiting for someone to finally look. So picture that canopy again, thick enough to turn noon into dusk somewhere in West Africa, 150,000 years ago. You're not lost there. You're not stranded there because the grassland ran out. You're there because, over uncountable seasons of trial and failure, people you'll never know the names of figured out how to read that forest. Which plants to soak, which monkeys to leave alone, which trees told you the rains were coming. And turned an environment the textbooks called a green desert into a home that lasted longer than most civilizations that came after it. Every rainforest still standing today carries the quiet fingerprint of people who got there first and stayed. The jungle was never really the barrier. It was just waiting for someone to stop assuming and start looking.